Hi, my name's Diana, and I'm gonna come at you today with my story. It's been a long journey, and I'm finally in a place where I can share comfortably, and I waited for a little while because I wanted to share it from just a place in my heart and from like my passion, as opposed to from a place of pain like I had been doing. A little bit about me: I'm almost 34. I'm a single mom of 5, got married at 17, and I'm first generation, first US born Romanian. So I'm also the first college graduate, and I a lot of first marriage out of the family, first grandbabies. But my story starts out as a little girl born in the ghettos of Detroit. Our family ran away from a communist country called Romania. The dictator's name at the time was Ceausescu, and we landed in Detroit. Our dad ran away first, and then our mom followed shortly after. And fast forward a little bit, our family found oasis in Arkansas, a little state. Many people say that they haven't even ever heard of it, but it's over there on the border by like Oklahoma, Texas, Tennessee, and not far from Florida. And that's where I grew up, in a really small town called Hot Springs, Arkansas, not too far from Little Rock. If you remember Bill Clinton, one of our presidents, he did high school in Hot Springs, and so that's kind of when Arkansas came on the map. My childhood wound up being pretty broken, along with, like, obviously I have 5 other siblings. There were 6 of us growing up. We grew up in a very immigrant type of household, so we knew how to be frugal. We always worked together. We babysat each other. We had a very different life than our American friends that we went to school with, because our parents were, they had come from a different world, basically from Romania. And we grew up in a way that was very different than the culture that we came into. So we kind of like fell in between 2 cultures. Like, we weren't quite Romanian because we hadn't grown up there, but we were picking up on all of these different traditions and the way that life was being done back in Romania. But then we weren't quite like American either, because we weren't born in America. Our parents weren't from America, and they were trying to conserve like all of our values because it was just so markedly different in America. So needless to say, my dad's side of the family, which is huge, the average family has somewhere around, between 4 and 8 kids in each family. We had a local church that was, it's Pentecostal, and we grew up, super conservative. The church that was formed even back in Romania before they immigrated here was a very conservative one, and was one that was founded on a new Protestant Reformation. And some Americans had come there, had propagated the evangelical, Pentecostalism type of religion, whereas in Romania the typical religion is Orthodox. So we had our own church. So we were like living in America, but not really. Like, we lived in our own little bubble in Hot Springs. We had a little church, and we believed in, different spiritual gifts and, all the things that a lot of the conservative Christian churches actually adopt, even as Americans. No sex before marriage. Our church was very strong in the belief of you have as many children as God gives you, so no birth control, kind of like Catholicism. And, the way I grew up, there were a lot of expectations that were placed inherently. It's not that we really sat down and talked about things in that way, but because they were talked about in church, and because, my best friends were basically my cousins, like, we didn't really get to have friends from school or go to the movies, really. It was like fraternizing with Americans was something that wasn't really like taken lightly. It was a really conservative type of situation. But fast forward a little bit, I was around my adolescent years, and I had 4 younger siblings, and our parents went through pretty gnarly divorce. And back when they went through it, there weren't very many resources. And as you know, we were part of a very conservative church. So the church was really, had a really difficult time accepting the separation and divorce as well. So it wound up that us as kids, we got caught in that crossfire, and there was a lot of trauma that happened in that divorce. So I remember being an adolescent and thinking to myself, like, I am ready to like start my own family. As a young lady, I had matured really quickly. I helped around the house in my way as a female, as a Romanian girl. You keep house and you help out with the motherly types of things. And for my brother, he helped out with all the manly things outside of the house. And so, we went through life and we coped as best as we could. I was in sports. I was a very strong-willed person even back then, from what I remember. Because as you'll find out, I kind of lost myself in the process. At one point, I had turned, I think I know I had some childhood wounds, parent wounds, where I felt like I had been like emotionally abandoned. And I think a lot of us go through that, and it doesn't necessarily mean that your parents physically leave you, but in a way you feel like you don't have this person protecting you and guiding you and teaching you how to do life. And so I started seeking external validation from males, from boys at the time, but men eventually. And, being a fervent Christian and like having all of these expectations that were like unspoken and that I felt like I needed to live up to, especially within the church. I was very active in the church. There was always an activity to be a part of. I felt like my only way out of this scenario, where it felt like just a vicious cycle, was going to be to get married. Having said that, I also had a firm belief that God would send me the right person at the right time. Now, I will say, I'm sharing this story in no way, shape, or form am I trying to shame my culture that I came from, the religion that I came from, or anything else. Not my ex-husband or my children's father, not his family, not my family, not anyone. This is purely me sharing my story because I hope that this will save countless young ladies from thinking that the only way out to freedom and to really get to know yourself is through marriage, or staying in an unhealthy relationship. So my journey began when I was 16 and I met my now former husband while he was in town on a mission trip. And a lot of people ask this and say, I got married at 17, and they ask, how did you get married at 17? I don't understand. Well, it's not like super common, but it's not really like super uncommon either to get married really young, because if you think about it, you're in the peak of like your hormones are raging, you're trying to figure out like, who are you? You want to get out of this like kind of like super controlling and conservative culture and create your own home and your own culture and your own family. And kind of like I wanted to create like the family that I never felt like I really had, that cohesive parenting. And so, whenever we had met, initially I had a different person I was talking to. That was a long distance relationship, and I was working towards finishing high school early and being able to move out of that town. I felt like I had outgrown it already. And so we met, and my, at the time, future husband told me that he had had a revelation and that someone had a vision, and that vision described me to a T. And there was just like a whole conglomerate of events that were just like checks and balances for me spiritually. Now, I'm no longer like super religious, but my faith is very experiential in nature and is still very much a part of my life. But at the time, I really waited it out because it just completely blindsided me. And it was kind of like that Cinderella fairy tale story that I wanted to believe that I'd been through so much pain and anguish that it was now time for me to reap the rewards and live the life that, I had only dreamt of living. And so my journey began at 16 when I first met my ex-husband, and we were engaged within a couple of months when I turned 17 in May, and we were married by the end of July in 2005. Now, little did I know, looking back now, hindsight 2020, I did see some red flags. They were very, minor, and thinking about the fact that like our dad was so culturally biased and heavy in his way, and I had seen, such a very patriarchal type of society that I was surrounded with, where men were very much in control of what women did, how women thought, what we were being taught, how to live, how to act. I kind of brushed it aside, and I was like, well, this is my new husband and I'm going to submit because that's what I've been taught. And so the initial time that I actually found out that this was probably a huge mistake was actually like very early on during our honeymoon. And there was a specific scenario that happened, and it was just like super traumatizing. And at the time I was like told to just like pack my things and go back to my dad's house, and that I was in Greece, and I was 17, so I was like beside myself and upset. And that was, looking back, that was definitely like a tool that he had picked up from his childhood, where he felt misunderstood and whatever the case was, and he had picked up all his tools from his street cred, back in Romania, and he was utilizing that as a control or manipulation tactic. And so that's why I say, like, this is not in any way, shape, or form to shame anyone. This is just to shed light on what it might look like, and people might just not understand the fact that this is what abuse looks like. Abuse does not necessarily have to be physical. When it's physical in nature, that's just a repercussion of all of these other layers of abuse that happen, and then there's an eruption of a physical trauma that happens. Because if you hit someone and it's not accompanied with all these other types of abuse, like emotional, psychological, spiritual, financial abuse, then that's just an accident. Like, it wasn't meaningful. So anyway, long story short, I realized that, I'm kind of like in a pickle at that point. And, but I tried to make it work, as best as I could. I came from a culture where it was really a big deal to me to not shame my family, to not shame my church. My family already had like whatever kind of reputation that they had within the community, that, our parents had split, they hadn't reconciled. It was one of the first divorces in the community, so it was a pretty big deal. And so I felt like, the burden was on my shoulders. And if you learn about covert abuse, a lot of the times the victim will actually protect and cover up the abuse. And we'll talk about like why we do that maybe later on, so I don't lose track of my story. But what happened was, the first year or two, I really went through a massive shift in my mood. I had been this really spunky person that, overcame a lot of things. I was super ambitious. I played different sports, even though I sucked at all of them. I just loved community. I loved making connections with people, having friends, feeling alive. And I think that was my way of coping with all the stress that we were going through. I really embraced like making my younger siblings, especially my younger sisters that I kind of took under my wing, super happy, giving them like the childhood that I kind of wished that I would have had. And so, as I'm going through these first couple of years of marriage, I became super depressed. and I had lost a lot of weight. So the first couple of years, I think I was just like trying to suppress and turn a blind eye, but I had like my cousins that were telling me, like, they were like, you don't smile anymore, like what's wrong? I had lost a lot of weight. I was having a lot of like GI issues, which I never had, like constipation, and I was just losing a lot of weight, and I thought it was because my ex and I were fasting together. We were doing a lot of like the religious type of things. We were under a lot of stress, and I kind of just like put it aside, and I would protect the relationship because I believed so strongly in the institution. I grew up believing that like marriage was a one-time shot till death do us part. Like, it's a vow. The problem with that, there's no problem with that whenever it's a healthy relationship. But what happened was, I kind of like, and I know that he told me and verbalized a few times, he was like, I have this thought in my mind, and I've always like envisioned my wife being a certain way. And so it was kind of like he was trying to deconstruct and reconstruct me into like the perfect partner for him. And I was so young. He's 10 years older. So, I mean, if you think about 17, I was super mature and super responsible and very structured, self-disciplined, but I was just naive. I didn't have a lot of life experience. And I really wish I would have had mentors that I had felt safe expressing myself to. If you think about it, like, I had kind of like a dysfunctional touch and go relationship with my parents. My cousins, I didn't feel safe with because all of them had kind of judged me. And the night of our wedding, I had heard that they were already talking about like kind of placing bets on how long we would last or not. And the last thing that you want to hear is, that they don't believe in the decision that you made. And then me being a strong-willed person, I was like, okay, well, we'll see about that. So this is for all the people out there that don't have those mentors. Like, take my story and just learn from it. Fast forward a little bit. Those first couple of years, I really took it into stride and was very submissive to the way that I ought to dress as per, his upbringing and thought process and interpretation of the Bible, dressing very, very differently than what I had dressed before. It seemed like I could never really get it right. I was, dressing in like skirts and had a head covering and kind of looked like probably 20 years older than what I actually was, and just looked like I was like from a village. And so all of those things were very noticeable to people, and they just like kind of like saw this person that was super resilient, and everyone was kind of like expecting to become like the shooting star, just slowly disintegrate and become like kind of like suppressed and oppressed norm. I just remained in that, like I said, out of like, I didn't want to shame my family, shame my culture, my religion. There was a lot going on there. I didn't want to like embarrass myself. There were a lot of times that I was told, there were a few times that I was told to just pack my things and leave, or he would pack his things and act like he was leaving me, and I would like cry and I would beg for him to stay. And those all those things, I just didn't know at the time. I wish I would have had someone to confide into, that those were just manipulation tactics. They were trauma bonding. And then in between those, negative moments, you'd get these small pockets of highlights where, you'd hear like the loving things, like the great things about you, the encouragement, and that's called love bombing. And so that would just like fuse you and make you feel closer to that person. I started out by helping him out. He had a project there that needed remodeling and needed to be spruced up, and I became like the property manager for 32 apartment unit. I learned a lot really quickly about life. There was a lot of like meticulous things that I had to learn. I learned a lot about telephone etiquette. I learned a lot about contracts, how to read, how to proofread contracts with state, with governing bodies, with Section 8, and then balancing also between the business life, balancing like the church life and what that was like. And for us, that meant a lot of volunteer work at the local church in the community, and just being these people that everyone could look up to. So we were this picture perfect type of relationship, and I didn't want to let all of these people down, that I felt like this is what everyone's looking for, and this is what everyone hopes for and dreams for. And I said, if I could only work my way to be the perfect partner, that something would click, and then we would be able to share this testimony of like how God changes people, and how, marriage is so important, and how family is so important. And that was really important to me because remember, I came from like brokenness. All I wanted was a whole family and a happy family. So had the first baby by 20. We had a hard time getting pregnant. Looking back retrospectively, I was very, very stressed out and had polycystic ovaries, and didn't realize it until I had one rupture, and I was in excruciating pain, and then had to have surgery before I was 19. That presented its own, difficulties and turmoil, but in the end, we got pregnant with our first child. I was in the middle of my nursing program, so I found out that's the one thing, the two things that they told us to not do in nursing school were don't get married or divorced and don't have a baby. And I was like, oh, we're good. I can't get pregnant. And they're like, that's what everyone says. And then they get pregnant. Lo and behold, by the end of the second semester, I found out that I was pregnant with our first child. And I couldn't interrupt school because I had already taken off a year from school. I had graduated early with honors from high school, and then I'd gotten married, and we took a year off just to focus on the apartments, on the buildings, and then we started school afterwards. And so I didn't have any more of that lapse time to take time off without losing my scholarship, so I just figured I'd muscle through. And so I had, our baby, our first one in September. It was third semester nursing program. I got to stay home for about a week, and then I returned to school after a week of having the first baby. Sat down, took a test, passed it, and then continued the nursing program. So between clinicals and, schoolwork and studying, it was a lot to juggle. And then at the same time, we were remodeling a home that we were in. The market collapsed, and there was a lot more pressure on me to finish school because he hadn't finished his school, and I was closer to finishing my degree. So there was a push for me to finish first and then to be able to support him to finish school. And, being close to my parents, like after having a baby, really did something kind of magical where I finally understood like what it means to be a parent. And I started, the synapses in my mind started clicking, and I was like, oh, they literally did, like, our parents did the best that they could do with whatever tools that they had. Like, they authentically loved us. They just didn't know any better. And that's not an excuse for, the difficulties that we had and the interruptions in our relationships with our parents. But that does, make a difference in, as you're an adult, being able to go back and heal those childhood wounds from your family life. So I had a lot of help from our mom locally. Our grandma came from Romania, and she helped out. Fast forward a little bit, I finished nursing school by 21 and saw my first death. Got pregnant, had our second child by 22 in 2010. Finished our bachelor program. I submitted one of my final papers for my bachelor capstone course the night I was being induced. So I was working a critical care job, doing practicum hours, had a baby, a toddler at home, was pregnant, which my pregnancies were always miserable. I had hyperemesis, and it was just very, very difficult to just even live. Like, I missed water. My ex-husband, because of the economic collapse, was now long haul driving, so I didn't see him but maybe once every few weeks for like a weekend. And so I had a lot of like time with my family. At that time, like, I was able to lose a lot of weight and just like focus on my health. I finished my bachelor program, and then all of a sudden, it was time, once I finished my bachelor, for him to get into his program, and he went into a program that was 3 hours away for MRI. And at that time, I'd gotten pregnant with our third child. Remember the story? Like, have as many kids as God gives you. That's like what we've been told. So that's all I know. So I was using breastfeeding as my birth control method. And that doesn't always work because you'll have a hormonal shift, and then, all of a sudden you're ovulating. Long story short. But at one point, he was traveling to and from, and I was holding my job. I was about to go back to work, had our third baby, but by the time he was around 6 weeks old, my ex-husband said, I need you guys to relocate here. I don't think I can do school and perform without having my family local to me. So what we did was we packed everything up, we liquidated and consolidated as much as we could, and I packed my bags and moved around 3.5 hours away from any of my family to Jonesboro, Northeast Arkansas. And I think that's when I really realized how strong I was emotionally. I was really, really nervous about moving away from any of the support systems I had. As disconjointed as they might have been, I had them. I had them as a backup plan. Like if, whenever I would go to work at night, I would take my baby to sleep at my mom's house, and then I'd go and I'd sleep there in the morning to rest, and I'd breastfeed in between naps and things. And, not having that crutch and having to rely on him was a very difficult, concept for me to grasp, but we did it anyway. And we moved there for the greater good of the family. But I really realized, I got a job there at the local hospital as a critical care specialty float pool nurse, and started out working weekends so that he could focus on school and I would focus on the kids during the week. And it became pretty clear pretty quickly that this was in 2012 that, we weren't going to be able to make it work with, even though I was working nights and on the weekends, he was not able to operate and function without getting uninterrupted sleep at night. And so my grandmother off my mom's side moved in with us to help us out for that 18-month period. And I was promoted. At that time, it was 2012. I was around 24, 25 years old. And I'd been recruited by one of the hospital supervisors who I had gotten really close with to become the hospital supervisor for the night's weekend position. And I took that position. It was one of the larger trauma hospitals in Northeast Arkansas, over 300 beds. And it was just a little inexperienced me taking care of administrative things and talking to physicians and advocating for nurses and taking care of patients and taking ICU, patients in an overflow area, and just like dealing with certain problems and really honing in on like my communication skills and kind of standing up for what I knew. And I still remember that during those times when it was really difficult and I was realizing that I wasn't getting as much help as I really needed from my life partner, my husband at the time, I got to a point where I said, you know what, I feel like I just need a divorce. Like, we're going to go through a divorce, but I don't want to do it now. I want our kids to be proud of their father. I want him to have a career. I want him, to be successful. I want them to feel like they have two successful parents, even though we weren't able to have a successful marriage. And at that point, I still remember very vividly, I was sitting in our bed at that time when we had just had an argument. And at that point, I was like, you know what? If I'm going to get a divorce, I might as well speak my mind. And that's when I found my voice again. And that's when I started speaking out. And that caused a lot of turmoil and arguments. But I said, it's come hell or high water. Either we're going to fix this and figure it out, or this is really going to end in a divorce. And at the time, things were shifting and it seemed like he was relinquishing a lot of control. But now looking back, there was a shift in the manipulation tactics. And as I was taking on more and more of the responsibilities, such as, house bills and finances and, all of these other, responsibilities that we call adulting, and not having as much of a partnership, I felt like there was something that was shifting. And I don't think, once again, I didn't have mentors that I felt safe expressing myself to, because, a lot of people ask this and they're like, well, why didn't you speak out and say anything to anyone? But I vividly remember once, I didn't even tell anyone, because remember, I found my voice in 2012. But probably even before our first child, we had a really big argument, and I had to call one of my friends and sleep over her house. That was the only friend that I really trusted, and she was younger than me and wasn't really a mentor, but I went and I stayed with her, and then her mother had found out and had confronted him, gently, and kind of rebuked him, and that turned into just a bomb that blew up in my face. So next time you ask anyone why they're not speaking up, understand that whenever they speak out and then that person that they're in a qualm with or in a relationship with finds out, they just double down on the detrimental communication that happens. So, understand that's the dynamic, just like in anything else. So there's a lot of fear and anxiety that's accompanied with it. But back to, Northeast Arkansas, I thought that there was a shift in the relationship, that we were making progress, that this was momentum, that we're finally getting somewhere, that now that we would both have careers, there wouldn't be any other issues. He had lost a brother a couple of years prior to that and went through a really deep depression and had a hard time, so I was super empathetic. But the problem was that when I started to realize, as I'm navigating, learning what it means to actually be an adult in the society, as like I went through my career steps and was talking to different people, I remember at one point that I learned about, psychiatric patients and like all these different mental health diseases. And once I started kind of treating him like a psychiatric patient, I felt like I was able to communicate better. And I thought that I would be able to communicate enough that it was going to change things. But that never happened, because that has to happen on an internal level, and that person has to face their own demons and trauma and heal from them and make the decision to actually change. So you're never going to be able to force change on anyone. That's just a really important concept to understand. And so, I went through this journey, and I still remember having a conversation with one of my mentors that I trusted, the one that recruited me into the position that I was in, that I loved. I loved being in administration. I loved problem solving. I loved being a part of, the bigger committees that were in, the up higher in the chain of command. I loved everything that I was contributing to the team and all the feedback I was getting and all the growth that I was having. And I didn't want to leave that area, because I felt like I'd grown so much, and I was finally able to kind of start living my life my way. And I remember talking to that friend of mine and saying, I think I want to file for a divorce. And she looked me in the eye, and we had a very candid conversation, and she had gone through her own divorce. And she told me, and I'll never forget, she said, "Diana, divorce is very, very hard. So if you can have even an ounce of hope that it will work, stick it out." And so that was the moment when I said, okay, I'm going to wait, and I'm going to do it for our kids. Our kids are still small. They don't understand the dynamics that are going on, and I'm going to stay. He had found a job that was closer to Hot Springs, but not quite back in Hot Springs, because I was enjoying being away from the super conservative church, even though I missed family and all the connections we had there because I grew up there. We moved to Arkansas. I got my dream job as a NICU nurse, working with preemie babies, and got my baby fever fix. But after a few short months, we realized that we were, I was working 60-hour weeks nights, and he was working 40-hour weeks days, and we were still barely making ends meet in Arkansas because of the lower pay scale, and living in an area that was more expensive than what was, really feasible for us, and still in our beginning phases. Remember, this is after the economic crash. Finally, we started picking back up in the economy. And so we looked at both areas and saw, where should we move? Where are we going to be able to make the most money so that I could take some steps back, because I had been working so hard to support our family and support his journey through school. That way he could step into the role of the main breadwinner. And we had a choice between either Chicago, which is where I had some friends and some church community I would have loved to have been around, or the Pacific Northwest, and more specifically Washington State, just across the bridge from Portland, where it was beautiful and, the topography is amazing and incredible, but it's super rainy. But he had 2 siblings there, and it was the West Coast. It was closer to his side of the family, which was in California state. And, we made the decision to go to the Pacific Northwest. And I truly thought that, it was a scary move once again. Like, now I'm moving not only 3.5 hours or, 300 miles away from my family. Now I'm moving over 2,000 miles away from any family. And that was scary for me because remember, like, I had made a decision in 2012. This is 2014 already. In 2012, I'm going to get a divorce. I just don't know what the right time is or if we're going to be able to turn the ship around. And so we moved to Washington State. And I had taken a travel contract there at one of the larger hospitals, and as a critical care nurse back to my adulting. He was going to find a job. It was a little bit harder to find a job as an MRI tech. So it was once again me stepping into that primary role and him kind of like being around the kids. And within a few short months, we moved there in about March of 2014, end of March. And within a few months, by the summer, he had realized that it was very difficult not having any family help. And so we had invited one of my younger sisters to move in with us. She was having a hard time back home in Arkansas. Even though she was doing really great in sports, she wasn't doing quite as well in academics, and she wanted a change of scenery. So she moved in with us. The thought was like she was going to help us out, with breakthrough babysitting. And soon after that, my actual maternal grandmother, who had helped us prior, also came out and moved in with us as well. So I had a couple of extra people that were helping me out with children. And within the next year, I was pregnant with our 4th child. And during that time, I didn't realize that this was going to be a major decision maker for him, but I started realizing that more and more he was interested in a business opportunity that he had heard about from some other people in the Romanian community, which was nowhere on my radar because I knew it would be super heavy on my shoulders once again and super, heavy responsibility. And I knew what I wanted. I wanted more time with our kids. Like, that was the whole focus. That was why I got married. I wanted to create that family. And it always felt like there was this carrot that just kept getting moved, like next goal, next goal, next goal. And I would ambitiously go after them and I'd reach those goals. And then all of a sudden there's a new goal that I would have to go and find. And so it became very cumbersome, and there were, it was a vicious cycle where we would just get into cyclical arguments, and I would verbalize myself and I would beat myself up out of mommy guilt because I didn't have this time with my kids. This is all I ever wanted. And it was always a justification and explanation. Well, we have this many kids. How are we supposed to pay for their college? We're never going to touch our student debt. It was always about these finances and security and things like that. And so, there was always a justification. And so I finally caved and I was like, okay, fine, we'll do it. We'll hustle, we'll grind. The kids are still young. This is the time to sacrifice. In a couple of years, startups take around that long. I remembered how it was with the apartments and how hard it was and how much time was dedicated. And, so we bit the bullet and we started, just working towards that goal, even though our credit was horrible from the economic crash. We had already filed, I had already filed bankruptcy by 22 years old. And, we had no reserves. We had used our reserves to make this big move 2,000 miles away and start from scratch. And we were living, off of the funds that we were making. He was having a hard time finding an appropriate fit for him in a job, work environment. And so a lot of it was just heavily dependent on myself. And, I realized slowly but surely that I'm just in this phase of it's perpetually, these responsibilities are falling on my shoulders, and I in return am, putting extra responsibility on our children who were innocent and young and should have just had a childhood and, been able to like live out that joy of a childhood. But if we'll rewind a little bit, back in 2014, we had purchased a car, and my dad and my stepmom had drove it from Arkansas to us for us. And at that time, my father had confronted my ex-husband and had said that he had heard some things from a woman that was on our honeymoon. She was in a different room, but had been witness to the altercation that had happened. Remember when I told you the big altercation that happened back in Greece? And she had told him that if her daughter was married to someone like him, that she would not be supportive of that marriage. And they got into a pretty big argument at the time. I had, once again, not been sharing any of my difficulties with anyone, even though they were able to see. They just couldn't fathom and understand why I kept protecting him. And I just kept my boundaries so tight because I didn't want people to know what I was going through, because I knew that it would be a forceful thing. And remember, like, as a child, as children, like, we went through such a traumatic divorce. That was the last thing I wanted for our kids. And my dad at one point had said, you know, if my daughter ever calls me and tells me that she wants to leave you, I will help her. And that was a big pivotal moment for me, where I felt like I would have probably been accepted, even though our culture was that way and our religion was in that way. Like, I would be accepted by my family and that they would receive me with open arms. Having said that, my dad and stepmom leave. They go back to Arkansas, and a few months later, we have another argument. And I'm pregnant with our fourth kid. And I called my dad at one point and I said, Dad, were you serious when you said that you would help me if I ever wanted to leave my husband?